show that I have a tremendous amount of respect for. He's someone that has been hugely influential on my thinking going all the way back to 2012. He is the publisher of the Gloom, Boom, and Doom report at gloomboomanddoom.com. His name is Marc Faber. Marc, thanks for being on the Rebel Capitalist Show.
Well, it's very kind of you to say that, and I look forward to our interview.
All right, let me start off with some easy questions for you. And I've listened to a couple of your most recent interviews, and I'll kind of reflect back on those. But I know that you are not a big fan of money printing, nor are any of my viewers. So can you start off by telling us what is the downside of money printing? Why is that a bad idea?
Well, I think it's easy to recognize that if the whole world decided to stop working and just print money and have a money printing machine on the beach, then nothing would get done in the world. You understand? Right. We don't live, eat, and drink and have housing because we print banknotes. We all have to have a job. That job then gives us some money, and with that money we can buy goods, whether these are consumer goods or capital goods or education or whatnot. But basically, the money printing process does not make the world richer, but I admit it has a powerful illusion of wealth impact. In other words, you understand, someone buys the S&P and the S&P is at the 500, and then the S&P goes to 3,000. Of course, he feels happy because the S&P has gone up and so forth, and he feels richer. And that may be the case compared to someone who didn't own the S&P. So through money printing, and this has been observed obviously by early economists like Copernicus and so forth, that when you print money, the money flow of the additional money that is being printed doesn't flow evenly into the world, right, and boosts all sectors of the economy. It can boost some sectors and it can retard other sectors. So traditionally, when the money is printed, it leads to some kind of increase in prices somewhere in the system. Now, in the 70s, this led to increases in prices of consumer goods. But after 1980 and up to essentially now, it's led to asset price inflation. And you may ask, why is it that we had in this case asset price inflation, and in that case we had consumer price and commodity price inflation? Well, you know, in economics there are many mysterious things. Why do we have coronavirus now? We don't know. It's not an economic event. So there are lots of things we don't know for sure. But in general, I would say that the breakdown of communism in the world increased the supply of labor very dramatically after China began to open up and after the Russian wall fell and so forth. And these people had lower salaries than we have, and they were willing to work harder and for less money than we. And so there was a supply shock to the world on the labor front. And of course, the entrepreneurs of the Western world, given that actually business had been slowing down already after the 1970s, the rapid expansion was in the 50s, 60s. And then after the 70s, it began to slow down. Basically, cost cutting became a very important factor. And the cost cutting occurred in shifting the production from the Western world essentially to low cost producing countries, including China, India, Vietnam, Eastern Europe, and so forth. And that kept wages in the Western world down. Not only that, but also regulation in the Western world made it very difficult and costly for entrepreneurs to actually have a manufacturing business.
Right. How important was the interest rate cycle starting in 1981, just going down to where we are today? How important was that in that whole process, or the decision for people to take those additional Federal Reserve or the banknotes that the Federal Reserve is creating, or just the reserves and the accounts of all the big banks under their umbrella, and create more money and lend that into the repo market, and that flows into the stock market? And instead of creating this inflation of consumer prices in the 70s, we have this asset inflation in 1980 to today. Did the down cycle and interest rates have a big part to do with that?
Initially, what is interesting is that in real terms, interest rates were negative in the 70s because interest rates were always below the rate of inflation. And it's interesting that after 1980, we had very high real interest rates, and yet the stock market went ballistic. So when people say, well, the stock market is going up because of low interest rates, I could say, well, in the 70s, in real terms, they were very low and the stock market didn't go up. In the 80s, in real terms, they were very high and the stock market went up ballistically. Mm-hmm. So it all depends from what starting point you measure the economy and the stock market. 1982, the stock market in the US was dirt cheap because it was at the same level than in 1964, or lower, actually. And in real terms, inflation adjusted, it had declined by over 70%. So the interest rates at that time, because they were in real terms very high in the 80s, I can say that they didn't have a very negative impact on businesses. Mm-hmm. But after year 2000, as you know, the interest rates on the Fed fund rate were kept artificially low between 2001 and 2006. And that encouraged people to borrow money to buy homes. So we had this colossal housing bubble. And many people overlook this fact. When interest rates are very low or perceived to be very low, it encourages borrowing or leverage. So if we look at the world today and we compare it to 1982, you and I, we can say in 82, the system was not perfect, but the debt level as a percent of the economy was low. Right. There was low leverage in the system. And today, we have an extremely highly leveraged economy, not only in the US, but globally, also in emerging economies. And as has been discussed and documented well, we have very high leverage in China. And when the economy slows down amidst high leverage, and you know that from the junk bond market, whenever the economy goes into recession, high yield bonds or junk bonds, they collapse because the companies don't have the money to pay the interest. So if we have, for instance, at the present time, we have a slump in the airline industry, in hotels, and in tourism, because companies use the coronavirus as an excuse to tell their employees, now you don't travel anymore. So they can save cost.
Right.
I'd say now airports are relatively safe because there are not so many people at airports.
Right.
And less people at airports than at the football game or basketball game or in a disco. So you understand? But it's being used as for companies to cancel events and so forth and conferences to cut cost. And so the companies in the hotel industry, if you look at, say, as an example, REITs, real estate investment trusts, are relatively safe investments. But at the present time, the REITs index of hotels in the world has collapsed because suddenly the hotels operate amidst very high leverage.
Right.
And so when the occupancy drops from, say, 90% to 70%, they're not making any money anymore. So right away, the dividends that will be paid by these hotel REITs will go down. Mm-hmm. And the airlines, as you know, even though they were full for the last 2 years, the earnings haven't gone up a lot because there was a lot of discounting. And again, companies tell their employees, you fly for 3 hours or less, or 4 hours or less, you fly economy. You don't fly business class, and so forth. Again, right. So a lot of cost cutting. And in my view, and this is well documented, the corporate sector in America is highly leveraged.
Yeah.
The household sector, as a percent of income, is not that high because they measure the interest payments of the household sector.
Right.
But we have, and this I didn't realize until I saw the figures and charts, on credit cards, you have record interest rates.
That's right.
And, this shows the problem of money printing. The rich people or affluent people like you and I, we use our credit cards for convenience. But poor people, they borrow money on their credit cards.
Yeah.
In an emergency, say you have a family, 2 children, one child has an accident, you suddenly need money for, a few months, you can't borrow from anyone else. Nobody else will lend you the money. So you borrow on your credit card.
Right. So do you think those high credit card interest rates are a result of the retail banking sector really having a hard time making money because of the flat yield curve? Or do you think it's a result of more people defaulting on that on those credit cards?
Both.
So you think it's both?
Default rates are up, but not dramatically. Mm-hmm. But look, I always say, a bank will always find money. It will always find ways to make money and screw people one way or the other. The bank really has to be. Warren Buffett once said, I like to buy businesses that even an idiot can run, because sooner or later you'll have a management team that is an idiot. And so, a bank is kind of a business like that. And when they really fail, the government comes in and bails them out.
Yeah.
Well, I think it may not happen again, especially if, say, Bernie Sanders is elected. He will just nationalize the banks if they have problems.
Yeah, exactly. I want to go back to something you said earlier because I think it's extremely important. And I talk about this all the time in my videos. It's really weird to me that people associate currency with the ability to consume. And instead of associating that with production and how much do I produce. And as a result of that, and I know you touched on this on some earlier podcasts that I listened to, or recent podcasts I've listened to, where if the person can focus exclusively on how much they can produce, working harder, and then look at the assets as kind of icing on the cake, that's a much better way to look at building wealth than where most people today look at it, and they don't really look at how much more they can produce or how much more value they can provide. They just look at how they can get rich on increasing asset prices. And can you expand on that a little bit further? Because I think that's just really, really crucial. And it's really weird how our society has gotten out of the habit of, or they've got this perverse way of looking at increasing their consumption levels or their ability to consume.
Yeah, sure. But again, the printing of money has not only the disadvantages of creating inequalities in the system or widening inequalities because it doesn't flow to all people in the same way, but it also has very negative social consequences. In other words, I would bet you that if we hadn't had all this money printing, whereby, a simple person reads in the paper that you have that and that many people who made billions from hedge funds. The hedge fund or a fund manager basically doesn't create wealth. You could essentially say, yes, he does, because he buys a company and then that company has the money and then they can create products and so forth. Yes, to some extent, I accept that view. But in most cases, it's led to speculation. And as we know from the private equity guys, it led mostly to the destruction of businesses. We can argue, it's good that some businesses get destroyed because that's the way capitalism works. Some businesses have to go out of business, and the clever operators like Amazon.com, they come in and they fill the gap and they do well. And the other guys who have the brick and mortar shops in the street, they go out of business because they didn't adapt. I accept that to some extent, okay? But it has led to the belief and to a society who essentially speculates.
Right.
And what you said is true. Lots of people, they think I buy a piece of land, I will become rich. Well, real estate does not always go up. In many cases where real estate has gone down or has been flat for many years, equally, not every stock goes up. Some go up and some go down. And I'd say because the money that was printed didn't really flow into so-called Main Street, it led to incredible speculation. And as you know, because of this asset inflation we had, young people today, and we have a lot of statistics, people at 35 today, inflation adjusted, they earn less than I earned at 35.
Right.
And they have less money than I had at 35. All my life, I worked. It's only in the last 10, 15 years that I started to pay attention on investments for myself. Before that, I just put the money in the bank and my business was very lucrative. So I never had to live on investments and on high returns. The high returns came from my work. Right. But nowadays, the young guys at 35, they can't buy a house unless they speculate and unless, like Donald Trump, had a rich daddy. So the rich daddy gave him some money to buy some real estate. And probably the best for Donald Trump would have been to do nothing in his life. Just stay on the real estate he owned. He would have been much, much richer. He's a horrible businessman. But I'm not talking here politics, but as a businessman, he's horrible. A lot of young people then speculate, and the volume recently on online brokers and like brokerage firms like Robinhood has more than doubled because everybody is speculating. Nobody can make ends meet. And when I was starting to work in 1970 on Wall Street, I could put my money on deposit at 7% interest per annum.
Yeah.
I could buy stocks with dividend yields of 6%. And then interest rates went up in the 70s. So you didn't have to be a genius. At 6% per annum, you double your money every 12 years.
Yeah, compounded. That's incredible. And as someone who has been in financial markets for so long, you've seen the system
Don't
on.
remind me. Don't remind me.
I apologize, but
Don't
it's
make me feel old.
no, but it's to your credit. I think that even me, I'm 47, but I've only been paying attention to this stuff since 2012, and I mean, we've got so much more history in inflation, the gold standard. How was it when the United States was on the gold standard prior to 1971? I mean, you were there, you experienced it firsthand. How was the attitude different, number one, with society in relationship to investing? And then also, did that really restrict the Federal Reserve's ability to create money, or the banking system to create all this money, and therefore create all of this inflation, which I think is the main driver of why there's such wealth inequality today? I think if we would have had deflation that we had in the 1800s, as an example, where prices went down by 50% from 1800 all the way to 1900, that the level of inequality would be a fraction of what it is today. But I'll let you expand on that.
Yes, I think you're right. Uh, I think that money printing creates a lot of inequalities, and it's an avenue to socialism. That I would say. I mentioned briefly the social consequences of monetary inflation. I think that has, the Fed will say, it's none of our business. This is a political matter. But since everything is connected, economics and social sciences and economics and the politics, I think it has something to do with it. Uh, if you ask me, I was born in 46, and this was just after the war. And I spent a lot of time with my grandparents because, for whatever reason, they actually liked me. That didn't happen a lot in my life, but they liked me. And so I could see a little bit the lifestyle they had. They never had a credit card. They never borrowed money. I think when they bought their house, they probably borrowed some money. But again, they didn't buy a house for the price appreciation.
Right.
They bought the house because of their needs to live somewhere. And I don't think my grandmother, she had some shares of a cable car company in the mountains because she lived there, and they had a hotel. And my grandfather had actually built this cable car company, and my uncle actually built the Titlis air cable company. This, as far as I know, the only cable car company in the world where the gondola that carries about 120 people can rotate 360 degrees while it goes up to the top of the mountain, to the glacier. So the tourists, they can watch all around the area in that gondola. So anyway, my mother's family is from the mountains, and they were pioneers of the winter sport in Switzerland. And so they never had any shares. They just had shares in the local economy. But it wouldn't have never occurred to them to speculate in the market. My parents, they were a little bit more aggressive. They owned some shares, but very few. I mean, most of the money was on deposit and in government bonds. And again, they didn't really buy for huge capital gains, and they didn't speculate, and they worked very hard. And if you ask me how life was at the time, then I'd say one thing. The golden years of America were the 50s and 60s. And as a result of these golden years, the currency also became grossly overvalued. And so when they went off the gold standard in 1971, the dollar really adjusted on the downside, with especially the German mark and the Swiss franc and so forth. But life at the time was very different in the sense that we didn't have, actually it's very funny because Milton Friedman has written about this many times. He said that Social Security has actually increased poverty in the US. It hasn't diminished poverty. And I can see that to some extent, that the security nets actually increase poverty rather than decrease it.
Right. So you think there was a dramatic difference in the attitudes or the way people thought about investing when we were on the gold standard compared to when we were off the gold standard?
But I would not necessarily say that it's because of the gold standard and not.
Okay.
You have to understand one thing, which I think is very important. There was never, ever a pure gold standard, except when people had or traded only with gold coins or silver coins, like at the time of Rome.
Right.
But even at the time of Rome, they borrowed money. There was a mortgage market. So you could, against your property, you could borrow money. But in the 19th century, when they talk about the gold standard, yes, banks held gold reserves, but they also took deposits and lent out money. So they had a paper money system, but it was not as extreme as it is today. And I would say that one thing has really changed. I mean, I don't think that today's world is much more dishonest than it was before.
Right.
But in some ways, it is more dishonest. I think that the US government, the federal government, started out in 1776 with a lot of good intentions. I really believe that they wanted to create a fair society and that people, they believed that everyone in the US would be welcome and that people should be free and also free from hunger, so that they would have opportunities. You understand? I really believe that this was the intention. But if I look today, and that began to change, I think like maybe 50, 60 years ago, it began to change dramatically. I think today's politicians, they have no clue what the original thought of the US was. I believe that they confuse freedom with absence of responsibility. You understand? You want to be free in your life. You're an entrepreneur. Well, sorry, you had to work hard. You had your responsibility to make a profit, to look after your employees, your family, and so forth, and to make a positive contribution. Otherwise, you couldn't have this program today. So
Right.
I think that today's politicians, their aim is actually to make money out of politics.
Right.
There's big money in politics. Look, you take an honest country. Then you look at government expenditure in say in an honest economy. There are no 100% honest economies, but there are shades, like Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Switzerland, and so forth. They're relatively clean, I say relatively. And you go to the other extreme from the Democratic Republic of the Congo to Libya to Zimbabwe, South Africa, and so forth. There, most of the budget is stolen. Now, let's assume a government spends, an honest country steals 5% of its budget, in other words, of the government expenditures. Well, let's say the US is relatively honest and only steals 5%. we're still talking about the budget in the US. In other words, federal government spending of $4 trillion.
Right.
You know what 5% of $4 trillion is? Is
Right.
$200 billion.
Right. Yeah.
It's a lot of money for the federal government to steal, and that is the assumption that they're honest. Let's say if I assume I would rather stay in Washington, they steal 20% of the $4 trillion. So we're talking about close to $1 trillion that goes somewhere.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it's I dislike all politicians. The right, the left, it really doesn't matter. Everyone who watches this channel knows that. I always say that I dislike all politicians equally. In the United States, I haven't. They're just they're brutal. But why do you think that the Scandinavian countries, you brought them up, they collect a lot of money in tax revenue, and most people don't understand that's mostly from the middle class. They just like to get, the left likes to get fixated on their high tax rates for let's call them the rich, but they don't understand that the majority of that money that they're spending for all those social welfare programs, that's coming straight from the middle class. And
the rich will never pay tax.
Okay, yeah, so that's one thing. Let's actually go off on that, because that's one of the questions that I had for you. Taking it back to the United States and this introduction or potential introduction to the wealth tax, I always get feedback and people trying to refute that, saying, well, that the rich will never leave the United States. We can go ahead and put on a 50% wealth tax or whatever it is over 50 million, and we all know that will go down. But they always make this claim that they'll never leave because there's no place like the United States, and they're not going to go to a third world country. But my point is, you've known a lot of really rich people. You're very well to do yourself. Are they wrong or are they right to assume that tax rates or the wealth tax wouldn't motivate a rich person to move somewhere else?
Wealth is relative. You're never rich enough. But what I want to say is, I think to some extent this may be true, but you understand, in America, even at the time when they had very high marginal tax rates on the wealthy, they didn't pay a lot of tax.
Yeah, the tax revenues compared to GDP was the same. I always use these charts.
Yeah. In my view, the wealthy, they don't have to move somewhere else. When every legislation in the US goes through Congress, by the time it's gone through all the various lobbyists and so forth, it's watered down. And what you will end with is the higher middle class, like say a doctor, he cannot cheat much on taxation.
Right.
Because he has to build the insurance companies and so forth and so on. He has employees. And so his income is very visible. The very wealthy people have a lot of income that is not so highly visible. And they have a lot of capital gains. And to tax capital gains is a very problematic issue, and I want to tell you why. Say your parents, let's assume, they bought a farm 100 years ago, okay, or 80 years ago. And the farm at that time was very cheap or low in price. And they held it, and now the land is worth that much. Mm-hmm. But as it happens, your parents pass away and they have 3 children. You understand? And the 3 children, they happen to like to keep the land. But under capital gains tax principle, A, your parents may not have been able to keep the land, and right. B, they may, the children that will inherit it, they will have to break up the land. Otherwise, they can't pay the tax.
Right.
And the wealth tax has some problems, and the Thai government is going to find out very soon. You see.
Are they trying it there as well? I didn't realize that.
On real estate, yes. But
okay.
Listen, shows again what you just said about governments. The economy in Thailand, at least for me, visibly, because I'm not an economist that only reads statistics in books and behind closed doors in a central bank building, but actually I observe people on the street, I observe the traffic, I observe the hotel occupancies, and especially I observe how many people are in nightclubs. Anyway, the economy here began to slow down. At the present time, I can assure you, it's a slump worse than during the great financial crisis.
In Thailand?
Yes, the economy is extremely weak. The whole of Asia is weak. But this economy here, I passed by restaurants, they have days where they don't have a single guest.
Is that because of the coronavirus or something else?
There are many reasons, but the coronavirus is one problem because the Thai economy, about 20% of GDP is tourism.
Okay.
And of the tourists, 28% come from China. The Chinese are absent. They're gone.
Right.
They're not coming at the moment. And so the hotels, and of course, as you know, money printing then leads to stupid investments. The hotel industry in Thailand expanded dramatically in the last 5 years. And the tourist industry, they bought buses for the Chinese because the Chinese are so numerous. You have to ferry them around in huge buses, not in small cars or mini buses. All these investments are on credit. All I want to say, in my opinion, the economy is very bad, and the stock market this year is down 15% after a bad year last year. Tells you a little bit something about the economy. Anyway, in its wisdom, the government now is introducing taxes on land. Not huge taxes, but say enough taxes to be meaningful for people who don't have other incomes.
Right.
But you can avoid these taxes by making your land agricultural land. So the government gives you trees to plant on the land, or you can plant bananas and other fruits. Now, everybody will plant something, you understand? Now, if everybody plants something, what will it do to farm prices? They will collapse.
Right.
We have a surplus of fruits, of vegetables already. And the tax increase at this time of the economic cycle is, of course, stupid, because a lot of people will be struggling to pay that tax.
Right.
And I tell you, all these taxes, they lead to endless cheating.
Right.
In Switzerland, we have many people, and the only ones who really pay the tax is where you have visible wealth. Say you have a house, you have to pay tax on that house. And it's a funny way to calculate. They will say to you, if you didn't live in the house and you would let it out, you would get, say, every month $3,000 or $5,000. So they calculate this as your income by living in the house. And on that, you have to pay tax.
So they calculate the tax on the house as though you rented it out.
They calculate as if you would rent the house. And then they assume that you would earn this in addition to your income. And so you pay tax on essentially your own home, and you pay a wealth tax and the wealth.
Yeah, it's just the middle class and the upper middle class that ends up paying the taxes, to your point. The rich have ways, because they have so many resources at disposal, to get away.
They have so many lawyers.
Yeah.
Lawyers.
Right. So I want to get, since you're right in the middle of Asia, and we talked about the coronavirus, that's really a hot topic. It's on everyone's mind for obvious reasons. How do you see that playing out in the global economy and then in the U.S. economy as well?
Well, I think that we don't know yet how severe it will be, but what we know is that it's unlikely that it came from bats in a market in Wuhan, let's say. It's not very likely. Some people still believe in Father Christmas and believe that 9/11 was uh, carried out by a man in a cave in Afghanistan or Pakistan and so forth. So let these people believe that. But in general, I would say it's unlikely that it just came from some bats in Wuhan. It's highly contagious. Say, if I send you an envelope today, some mail, and I have the virus, and you receive the envelope and you open it, you might contract the virus.
Yeah, what are the economic impacts on that in the world economy? I mean, obviously the health concerns are very legitimate, but even more so than the health concerns, I think the economic impact could just be really huge.
The economic impact, if it's not over tomorrow or next week, is going to be, and I hate to say that, it's going to be devastating.
Yeah.
Believe me. I mean, say you're a cruise ship operator and you're the consumer. Would you now go on a cruise ship and be exposed to the risk of being quarantined and maybe running out of beer and whiskey as drinks? That is the worst part. In an extreme case of quarantine, you're not even allowed to leave your room.
Yeah. And so how does that play into the U.S.
Now,
economy
can
that's
you
already so
imagine
fragile?
staying with your wife for 2 weeks or 4 weeks in the same room?
Yeah,
It
yeah,
would
that's the worst
kill
part,
me.
right?
Yeah, that's the worst part. Also for the wife, but to be fair, we have to be politically correct here.
Yeah, that's right. But so that really could have an impact on, especially on the U.S. economy, that to your point is so fragile with all these asset bubbles.
Yeah,
It's not the size of the bubble, or it's not the size of the pin, it's the size of the bubble. And I just see that potentially being the black swan or the tail risk that could really bring down the U.S. markets because they're so levered up.
yes, I agree with you. This is this. I, I still maintain we don't know for sure, but if it's so contagious, as I just pointed out, and it spreads, and something is important in today's economy. A lot is hot air. You understand? This whole social media stuff is basically hot air. And going back to the people who want to make money without work, the social media crowd is a phenomenon of mostly people who want to be famous
Right.
without delivering anything.
Right.
They have nothing, but they feel entitled to be as famous as Taylor Swift or whoever that might be. So, or the Kardashians.
Right.
So, yeah,
Right.
but you understand, some people have something to add to the equation, but a lot of this social media is just hot air, and so the psyche of people is such that even if the coronavirus right now, the likelihood that you would die at your age from catching it is not very high.
Right.
But you understand, if you catch it and you have to go into quarantine, not in a hospital or so, it's a horrible experience. And in the quarantine, the likelihood of dying increases because you're exposed to other people. And so I would say uh, the chances of you having a car accident is much higher than you catching the coronavirus. But people are not used to this sudden kind of disturbance.
Right.
And so the psychological impact is huge.
Yeah, that's really it's the
And
psychological impact that leads to the economic impact. Yeah.
yes, and I said before, the corporation use this as an excuse. No more conferences, no more traveling. And I can tell you, in the world, the conference business, the travel business, the hotel industry, in Thailand, Hong Kong, and so forth, restaurants, hotels, airlines are the largest employer. This is a big, big employer in the world.
Right, right. Marc, I want to be cognizant of your time, and it's just been a great interview so far, but I'd really be angry with myself if I didn't ask you a more investment type of question. You know, how can we make money?
Yep.
And I know that you just got an awesome worldview. So I'd like to ask you the question for right now, if you had, I'm going to say, a 5-year and 10-year time horizon. If you could pick
Yes.
one country to go long, which country would that be?
Well, I think that right now I would actually wait to make major investments because, look, I think we had a bull market, a structurally since or secularly since 1981,
Right.
but more so, say, from a cyclical point of view since 2009. Actually, in a few days, we're 11th year in the so-called bull market. Maybe it's over now, but anyway, and 11 year, 11 year in economic expansion will be in June. So we're in a very old bull market, and now the market dropped for some stocks. Tesla from the peak was down 33%. And despite all the BS that the mainstream media will tell you, on Friday the market at its low was no higher than it had been in January 2018,
Right.
when the S&P reached 2,840.
Mm-hmm.
And in September of 2018, the S&P reached 2,940. So basically, at the low last Friday, we're no higher than 2 years ago.
Flat, right.
But we are, of course, elevated in other respects, especially in bonds. The bond market has been rallying a lot. Over the last 12 months, you did better in US treasuries, in long-dated treasuries, than in stocks. And you have the FANG and related stocks that are in the sky, like in 1973. At the time, we had stocks like Kodak, Polaroid, Sears, J.C. Penney, Levitt's Furniture, Kresge, which became Kmart, and so forth. They were all in the sky, and Xerox. But we have a heavy concentration of stocks. When they go, who knows what will happen? But I think the first decline we had is actually not a buying opportunity. I think we can go quite a bit lower.
But do you think there's a buying opportunity right now in any other countries, like emerging markets
In
or?
emerging markets, the valuations have come down. But I'm sorry to say that the economic outlook, under certain conditions, if the coronavirus is really very contagious, it could really hit global trade. I'd like to point out, my view is that it's not the coronavirus that will cause the next recession, but it could be the catalyst that suddenly people think differently and act differently. And suddenly they will say, well, I'm not going to buy anything from China because it could be infected with the coronavirus, and so forth and so on. So you understand, the psychology of people may change a lot, but it can be a catalyst. And I just read a book about, that big changes in the distribution of wealth usually only happen through wars and revolutions and plagues, because otherwise the wealthy people will never voluntarily give up their wealth. You have to hang them up or put them under the guillotine, like in France,
Right.
that that you can take their wealth away. Otherwise, they will resist.
Right. But a lot of people argue that that's why we should have a wealth tax. And I can't imagine. I mean, obviously you're not in favor of that. So what is the solution? Is it more free market, less government? I mean, it seems that all the problems that people on the left point out in the United States could be solved with a smaller government. If the government just didn't have as much power, there'd be less crony capitalism. You can go on down
Yes.
the list. But what's the
Right.
solution to that wealth discrepancy?
Well, I have a very easy solution. An 80% bear market in stocks.
Yeah, exactly.
It's going to
Okay.
solve that.
Right.
That is the solution.
Right.
But the Fed, and everybody will say, well, it will kill people, and the Main Street. I'm not so sure about that. I will give you an example. We had a great financial crisis in Asia, and it really killed the markets. I mean, the stock markets went down a lot. But in an economy like Shanghai, I have a stock brokerage account in a local brokerage firm, but the head office is in Bangkok.
Right.
This is the branch, and I think I'm one of their only customers. Seriously.
Wow.
There are a few Chinese are probably customers, but none of my expatriate friends has a stock portfolio. None.
Right. Well, that goes back to what we were saying at the beginning of the interview. So right now, the bottom line is we kind of sit on the sidelines. That would be your suggestion. See how this plays out, and if there's some cheap stocks in any country, the United States or outside of the United States, then maybe take a look at that when you can see that get a handle on where the coronavirus is going and if it's going to be a big impact from a psychological standpoint, and then of course an economic standpoint as well.
I look at hotel stocks, say in Hong Kong, and casino stocks in Macau. But they're nowhere near as low as in 2009.
Right.
Nowhere near as low. And by the way, Las Vegas Sands, okay? In, I think, 2006, 2007, the stock was at, say, 130. Don't quote me. I don't remember exactly. I could check, but it's not relevant. Then the stock went down to 1.5, okay, during the recession.
Wow.
Because there were question marks about will there be enough money to pay for the casino they were building in Singapore and so forth. And then the stock after 2009 rallied and it went to like $150, something like this. But I think at the present time, these casino stocks in Macau, they're not yet good enough value. Because if the virus is over tomorrow, then it's okay. But if the virus continues and the casinos are closed for, say, a year, I tell you, most would have problems, financial problems. A year's closure.
Absolutely.
Companies don't have the reserves for 1 year.
Yeah, right. But they still have the debt.
Yes. This is another point. The government bonds have rallied recently strongly. But I can tell you, bonds of hotel companies and casinos and airports and hotels and so forth, and oil companies, or bonds of these fracking companies and so forth, they have been slaughtered. I would say, even without virus, just let's look at the market. Is the market cheap or not? It isn't.
Not at all.
By no valuation measure, it's cheap. The dollar is relatively high. interest rates, yeah, maybe the Fed can force them into negative territory. In Europe and in Japan, negative interest rates have been a disaster.
Yeah, and yeah, they'll continue to be a disaster as well for the economy, the banking system. I want to try to end on a positive note, Mark. And
Yes.
I remember that I listened to a podcast that you did the other day, and I found it fascinating that one of the suggestions that you made, one thing that is cheap right now, is you said real estate in in countries in Europe, and I'm not sure if this applies to other areas in the world, where that are outside of the urban areas are extremely cheap right now. And you said if you were young, or a suggestion that you would give to someone who didn't have a lot of capital or a lot of investment money set aside for investing, maybe consider something like that where you could get it at a discount. You said there's some places that were even giving properties away,
Yes, sure.
and then figure out maybe an Airbnb or a way to change the use case for that property to actually generate cash flow. And for someone with not a lot of money to invest, I just think that's a really neat idea. Could you, before we go, could you expand on that briefly?
Yes, first of all, I think that a trend that began a while ago, and we have statistics about that, and these statistics are not distorted by government figures. More and more people work from their homes.
Right.
You understand, we are in an economy where you have more and more people, they are like part-time employees in a company, or they get a job from a company, but the company doesn't even want to have them in their offices. They say, in 3 months, come with the results of what we told you to do, and so forth. So a lot of people work from their homes. I have an office here, but it's next door to my house, and I stay in Chiang Mai. If I were 20 years old and I was in the financial field, then probably I wouldn't be here. I'd be hustling around Hong Kong or Singapore or New York or London, or in a financial center. But at my stage in life, I can do that because of the internet connections and communication connections. And so I believe a trend is on the way where companies realize that it's incredibly unproductive for someone to take a train in the morning, travel 1.5 hours to the office,
Right.
works, and then travels 1.5 hours back. So the companies will tell their employees, look, come in for meetings, but the rest of the time, you're free to work from home. But you have to do your job, and you have to report to us so we can see what the results are. And so I think that this trend is on the way. Now, the coronavirus has already led to some companies telling their employees, stay at home.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the companies will make good experiences with the stay at home policies. And so it's a trend that will take on. You could live, say, at practically no cost in the countryside somewhere in Portugal, Spain, Italy, Sicily as part of Italy, of course, and also in Germany, in the countryside, and even in England, in the countryside. Uh, you could spend very little on your housing cost,
Mm-hmm.
and have a nice place. And if you have uh, halfway some brains, you can actually fix up the place yourself.
Right.
You don't need to be a genius engineer. But nowadays, there's so many courses that teach you on YouTube how to do something. So even someone not that talented can maybe learn. And the local people, they can also help you a little bit at a relatively low cost because you can pay them under the table. Anyway, all I want to say is I think that considering the very high level of cost of city centers, you
Yeah.
know how much the rent is in Madison Avenue in New York, around the 50th, 60th Street, and so forth, is astronomical. The same in Hong Kong in the main shopping streets. And more commerce occurs through e-trade, in other words, e-commerce. This is a big thing for the luxury goods companies. They have whole teams that analyze how to drive e-commerce sales. In other words, no longer they have storefronts for the advertising, but maybe they could have advertising without all the cost of the entire store.
Right.
Because I'm old-fashioned, I still go to a shop to buy things, whereby I only buy things, the beer supply that I need, the cigarettes and the whiskey that my staff buys for me. But when I need to buy shoes, then I go maybe once every 2 years to buy a pair.
Right. You got to keep the important stuff in case you get quarantined there in Chiang Mai.
It's also like the hotel industry. Airbnb is a huge negative for hotels. Incredibly negative.
Yeah, but to your point, if you could get one of these cheap properties out in the countryside in one of these countries that are almost giving them away, you could turn it into an Airbnb, live there, so you have no housing costs. I mean, you could really get creative with it. And I didn't know that in Europe, in the countryside, though, the housing was so cheap. So it's really.
I tell you why. Because also in Switzerland, it's hard to believe, but in Switzerland, we have mountain villages. They died out. The young people have no employment, so they go to the cities and work in the cities. And the parents, when they die, nobody lives there. So we have villages where actually the government will give you a house, but you have to fix it up. You understand? It's not entirely free, but considering how, say, if you live in New York, you should know how expensive it is to live in a decent place. Yeah. Whether you own the property or you rent, it's expensive because if you rent, the rent is high, and if you buy, the maintenance cost is very high.
Yeah. Well, I'm in Medellin right now. I do a lot of real estate investing in Colombia, and I've done it in the United States. So I totally understand what you're talking about on a price per square meter or price per square foot or the rentals.
Sure.
Yeah. All right, Marc. Well, I really appreciate it. And
so you have properties in Medellin.
Yeah, I do a lot. I'm in Medellin right now, and I do a lot of real estate investing here. Exactly what you're talking about. I go buy old apartments and I fix them up, and I either keep them in a rental portfolio or sell them.
People tell me it's a really nice place.
It's gorgeous. Absolutely gorgeous. The weather's great. The people are great. The food's great. Extremely low cost of living. And you've got a lot of the digital nomads here as well, to your earlier point, that they don't need to be in an office. They don't need to be tied to a brick and mortar location. So,
okay,
Marc, for those of the viewers who want to find out more about what you do, can you tell us where to find you? We talked about the website before. That's gloomboomanddoom.com. For any of those who are interested in looking at a newsletter, I would highly suggest looking at what Marc has to offer. Just some great, great stuff. But is there any other place where people can find out more about you?
Well, I think this is the essence, the website, and they can Google my name. So usually, some interviews like yours will be put up. But thank you very much for trying to advertise my services.
Well, no, thank you, Marc. Again, it was just really an honor, and I want to thank you for just putting yourself out there, because I've learned so much from what you do and just your research and all the videos that I've seen of yours on YouTube. So it was really an honor.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.